The Nintendo Switch 2 has been officially presented to the masses, with journalists and content creators finally putting their hands on it to provide us with their informed, deeply thought and unbiased first impressions. And as much as everyone seems to have enjoyed the hardware improvements and new features, a dark cloud has cast its shadow on what is already a not-so-perfect console reveal. So, will the Nintendo Switch 2 be a failure? Now, let me address the elephant in the room: pricing. In my previous video about the Nintendo Switch 2, I said this. Maybe Nintendo will not turn out to be a greedy corporation trying to extract as much money as it can from gamers and fans. Well, I was obviously wrong. It was initially reported that the new console alone will cost you $450 in the US of A, £450 in the UK and €450 in Europe. Add 50 of your preferred currency if you want to get the new Mario Kart World bundle. Quite the inflation compared to the $300 of the OG Nintendo Switch console. But it doesn't end there, dear viewers. The brilliant, and now I can say it, greedy minds at Nintendo decided to further empty your wallet by jacking up the prices of the Nintendo Switch 2 games to a whopping $80, pound or euros a pop. But as I said, these were the initial reports, because since we live in crazy times, a new development in the Switch 2 pricing saga has unfolded in less than a week. Thanks to a certain president starting a trade world war via tariff hikes, which many believe will send the planet back into a new inflation whirlpool, Nintendo decided to pause pre-orders in the US of A until further assessment of the tariff's impact on the console's MSRP. To be clear, I do not care about politics, but while this issue is limited to the US, for now, it is quite the bad omen for the rest of the world. It is also an extremely bad omen for the already expensive hobby of gaming. I will go as far as to say that it is not very unlikely that gaming will become a luxury in the very near future. So, with all that said, the Nintendo Switch 2 hardware looks good, the gaming performance makes a substantial leap, the launch lineup looks stellar with even more interesting games releasing later, the new chat and community features might blow a wind of fresh air into the online modes, so if it wasn't for the pricing controversy, the Nintendo Switch 2 should be promised a bright future, right? Well, it's not so simple. And if you take off your Nintendo fanboy glasses for the next few minutes, you'll understand what I mean. Let's look into it with a critical eye. First, the hardware. I will be the first to admit that the Nintendo Switch 2 looks really good with its bigger and better screen, even if it's not an OLED, and the bigger Joy-Cons promising a more comfortable handheld gaming experience. I also like the nice all-matte black aesthetics, which makes it look less like a toy. But the handheld competitors like the Steam Deck and Asus ROG Ally already offer similar and maybe better features, especially when it comes to the OLED screen. I would say that the external changes position the Nintendo Switch 2 in a much more direct line of comparison to the PC handhelds than what the OG Switch was, without offering any decisive improvement in terms of convenience and comfort. One could even say that because it is now bigger, it could be seen as a downgrade in terms of portability. Second, and somewhat related, is the gaming performance. Yes, the Switch 2 graphical power is a significant upgrade compared to the OG Switch, but it is still playing catch-up to the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X in docked mode. And I would dare to say, it doesn't seem to be much more powerful than a Steam Deck or ROG Ally X in handheld mode. Sure, the Nvidia chip might offer a feature set that's better than what the AMD-based handhelds can do, especially when it comes to frame generation, image upscaling and other AI bonanza. But until we get the performance and benchmarking charts from Digital Foundry, there is nothing indicating that games will run better on the Switch 2 than on an Asus ROG Ally X with its Z1 Extreme AMD chip. Next is the launch lineup. And yes, it looks amazing, but apart from Mario Kart World, there is no other confirmed Switch 2 exclusive available on launch day. All the other games are ports from either PlayStation 5, Xbox or PC. So unless you love Nintendo's first-party games, there isn't really anything compelling you to upgrade from the OG Switch to the Switch 2. Especially if you already have a Steam Deck or an Asus ROG Ally, or any other console for that matter. And last but not least are the new chat and community features. I believe that the C button with all of its chat and community features might backfire royally on Nintendo. You see, as a gamer dad, and I am sure I am not alone in this case, I feel comfortable with my young kids playing online on the OG Nintendo Switch precisely because there is a very limited amount of interaction with other players, which as a father assures me that my kids will not be exposed to online toxicity or worse. Which is exactly why, knowing that the Switch 2 might allow much more online interactions, encourages me to hold back and wait before investing in it. Nintendo might as well have implemented the best online community features on the Switch 2. But as a father, that's a gamble I am not willing to make. So, all of this is to say that replacing one of the GOATs of console sales, namely the Nintendo Switch 1, will not be an easy feat to pull off, even for what is now the dean of console makers. Looking at the history of Nintendo, console success in terms of sales has always been like a pendulum. One console would be hugely successful, only to be followed by a relatively disappointing new generation. This is especially the case when the price of the new hardware is much higher than the old one, and new games are released on both the old and new generation of consoles, which will most probably be the case between the Nintendo Switch 1 and 2. While Nintendo is clearly willing to take a hit in its game sales by overlooking the more than 150 million of Switch 1 consoles and limiting new first-party games to the Switch 2 to support its sales, other game publishers will most certainly not follow suit, which means that we will continue getting cross-generation releases for quite some time after the Switch 2 launch. This will result in only hardcore Nintendo fans buying the Switch 2 at launch to play the shiny, new, first-party Nintendo games, and while their number is not negligible, Nintendo will need to motivate other buyers to quickly invest in the new system, which is going to be extremely difficult if the already high price is further exaggerated thanks to the tariffs. Another factor to consider is that Nintendo is no longer the only viable solution to game on the go. In short, despite the positive media reception of the Switch 2 across the board, its future couldn't be as uncertain and as far from the smooth ride that everyone thought it would be. Because it simply doesn't bring enough to the table. It is an iterative evolution of a proven concept, and the sum of all its new features and improvements cannot and do not amount to the much higher price tag compared to the Switch first of its name. In summary, I personally think that while it will not be the record-setting console that the Switch 1 still is, the Nintendo Switch 2 will not be a major failure either. While it will certainly not expand the Nintendo audience, it will find its niche like every Nintendo console does. But if history repeats itself, the Switch 2 will be disappointing enough for Nintendo that it will look for a new revolutionary concept and disruptive hardware for the following generation, kind of like the Switch one was developed because of the Wii U catastrophe. And that's precisely why I am leaning towards skipping the Nintendo Switch 2. At least for now. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below.